Hello, hello. Hey, everybody. Our next guest today knows pretty much anything about everything with culture. She's been studying intense, interesting, and sometimes horrifying cultures her entire life. She's actually third generation raised in one of the worst modern day religious cults known as the Children of God. At the age of 15, she escaped this cult, made her way to San Antonio, where she inserted herself into high school, graduated, got her college education, moved her way into the Army, where she became a captain in military intelligence. During her service, she deployed twice to Afghanistan, becoming one of the first women to conduct deliberate ground combat operations at a time when it was illegal for women to do this. These days, she does organizational behavior, cultural strategy consulting, and she's a renowned international speaker, including TED Talks. She's a leadership coach, and she's a podcast host. She helps CEOs and business leaders develop and employ an intentional growth culture in their organizations. Among other things, she enjoys a nice glass of Cabernet. Give it up to my friend, Daniela Young.
My name is Brian Shinborn. I'm an explorer of people, places, and culture. In my travels, spanning over 20 countries across 4 continents, I've had the pleasure of engaging in authentic conversations with amazingly interesting people. These are their stories, on location and unfiltered. Presented by 8B Media, this is Half the City.
What's up?
Hi, Brian.
How's it going?
It's going great. I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about. I've been talking origin stories lately, right? So, I feel like in order to get to where we're at now, we kind of need to start from the beginning and kind of work our way up there.
Absolutely. It's certainly a bit of a complex tale. So let's actually start way before I was born in the very late 60s, which was the middle of, of course, the hippie era in the United States. A lot of young people rejecting the culture at the time and searching for something new. So this man, who was from a family of preachers already, started preaching on the beach to the hippies of California. And he found a market for his message. And he started this group. It was called Teens for Christ, and then it quickly became called Children of God. Later, it became known as the Family of Love and the Family International. And it started off as, leave everything in the world behind, love Jesus, love each other, live communally, and go out and preach the gospel, and, of course, prepare for the end of the world.
So, that sounds like a pretty good mission.
It sounds okay. Yes. It very quickly became, he began to preach that he was the anointed prophet of God. His followers were the army of God put on earth for the end time. So literally the exact definition of a doomsday cult. And those usually don't end well.
Maybe got Jonestown and stuff like that, right?
Pretty much. And actually, if you listen to some of the stuff on Jonestown, it was very similar.
Wow.
The Children of God grew actually a lot bigger. So it lasted for about 40 years. It dispersed all over the world. It had up to about 100,000 members pass through it, but it was usually 10,000 strong at any given time. And slowly his message changed from being all about God's love to being all about sex as a way to show God's love. So this ended up including what they call religious prostitution, or using sex to bring new members into your organization, new members or money. Children started coming along, and it started introducing a lot of pedophilia, a lot of incest, really people were trying to navigate a society that they had built that wasn't liable to the laws or morals of any normal society. He then, got a revelation from God that America was evil and all of his followers needed to change their names and go abroad to third world countries to win the world for God, which is also, of course, a great way to hide from authorities, right?
Yeah, you could say
and
that.
So
low profile.
My mother was born into this. My mother was actually one of the first children born into this cult, which was by then very much a cult. Yeah. My mother was born and raised in that, went through some of her own, especially harrowing experiences, and then ended up getting pregnant with me when she was 14.
Wow.
My dad was about 43, had, 6 to 10 other children, was married to someone else. This was all this very, I don't even know that the term polyamory was invented at the time, but
polygamy. Like Mormons,
everybody living
right?
together and all of that stuff. Yeah. So I ended up being born in the Philippines with a 15-year-old American mother, but who had not been in America for her entire life. And I born literally in a commune behind big concrete walls, topped with broken glass, with people from all over the world, mostly Americans, British, other sort of modern Western cultures. And then there would be a lot of sort of local disciples wherever that commune was at. And, it was very much run with kind of a military structure where there was different levels of leadership all the way up to the top, with the leader who lived in hiding for the rest of his life. And we moved around too, kind of very similar to the military. So I ended up, spending the first couple years of my life in Asia, then moved to South America where I was in Peru, and then for about 10 years in Brazil. So I spent, the majority of my youth growing up in Brazil, but still in an American commune in Brazil.
That's crazy. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I don't want to dive too deep on it because we've got other stuff to talk about, right? And I don't want you to be defined by that, right? Like it's part of your story, part of who you are. I'd love to know tons of details about that, obviously. But I'm more interested in, so you were raised into this environment. That backstory is, it's the whole, like the way that everything came together with that and like how you came to be because of that is, to me, it's, fascinating. But I'm curious about how you went from there to where like this is the only thing you knew, right? This was your world, right? You're born into this, your mom, your dad, everything like this. When you're in an environment, when you're in your own world, that's all you know, and so that's normal, right? So I'm wondering, like, you escaped at 15. I want to know, like, how you, like, what it was that made you realize that what you're involved in was something that you shouldn't be in, and like, where that was when that point clicked. And how you made the decision to make that escape, make your way to San Antonio, and all of that.
Yeah, for sure. So I made my way to Houston.
Oh, Houston, sorry. For some reason, I've got San Antonio in my head.
Okay.
I'll fix it, but...
So I would say one of the, like you mentioned, this is a whole story. Of course, I'm working on a book.
Right.
But, there's sort of these big things when you grow up in a world like that, and when I do speak about this, I say, yes, as children growing up there, we all experienced sort of sexual abuse, physical abuse, what they're now starting to define as religious abuse. And then there was also this kind of denial of an education. We said we were homeschooled, but really we just weren't educated. And so, but altogether, what this rolls up to be is we were denied a childhood. So there was a whole group of about 5,000 children that just didn't have a childhood. We spent our entire childhoods in institutions, standing in lines. I describe it these days when I see my crazy daughter acting out as I was not allowed spontaneous moments of joy in my childhood. And I've realized very interestingly, because I've been asked my whole life, how I didn't get brainwashed, or like you said, like how I came to even decide to get away. And And I think you've hit on some very interesting things. And one is that when that's all you know, that's all you know. And it is very, very difficult. And even these days, when I tell the story or when I read other people's accounts, it seems surreal even to me because I've been in the normal world for 17 years now.
You've lived a whole different life.
And it
at
was
this point.
so crazy. At the same time, I'm one of those people, I'm certainly one of those children that is very high energy, always questioning everything, always poking and prodding, which has worked out great in my adult life. In my childhood, what did that mean? That meant I was always in trouble.
Yep.
You know, I was always in isolation. I was always getting, you know, sort of physically punished. And so then I wanted to act out. And, you know, you could kind of compare this to like a 15-year-old teenager in the normal world that's never getting love or attention from the adults around him.
Oh yeah, I was a super rebel.
Exactly. And so I was a super rebel. I just happened to be rebelling against something that the normal world considers to be bad in the first place.
Sure.
So, you know, at the time, like when I was 15, everything I was doing was wrong. Years later, now that everyone's out of the cult, they can look back and see that, oh, hey, I had the right idea. But from the age of, you know, I was 6 years old when I was told, you know, if you grow up and you backslide from the family, you're not in the family, then you're going to hell. And I remember thinking, man, hell's going to suck, but I'm not going to stay here. You know, and when I was 11...
Hell's got to be a shitty place, but it's way better than this right now.
Yes. And when I was 11, I started trying to make plans to escape. But of course, I lived in the middle of Brazil, and I had nobody on the outside. So the plan to escape was more just one day I'm going to be gone. And then a very interesting story I'll share with you, which I have a published article on 9/11. We were in the U.S. actually, just sort of briefly traveling through the U.S.
So you were still in
the cult.
When 9/11 happened. Okay.
We came to the U.S., which was the biggest culture shock of my life, coming to the United States. And then 9/11 happened. And that was actually the first time I saw live TV on in my house, right? Like live news.
And this was what? You were 14?
I was 14 years old. And I remember, of course, being horrified, being scared, sort of the same feelings that everyone had. But we were immediately told by our leaders, you know, this is God's punishment on America.
Of course.
America's evil, which is something we'd been told our whole lives, that this is the beginning of, you know, the Antichrist coming or Jesus coming back, whatever it was. And I specifically remember this moment watching a profile on the terrorists, and they called them religious extremists. And I'd never heard that term before. And I somehow immediately made the connection that we were also religious extremists.
Wow. That's really crazy that you would, I mean, again, going back to that whole concept of this is all you know, right? And then the first time you ever see live TV, 14 years old, you see these burning buildings, right? And then you hear about these religious extremists, and you immediately make that connection. Like that, being able to put those things together when you don't know anything else is just like that. It's mind-boggling to me. Like it's like amazing. Like I can't, like the way that you can just put that together when you don't know any better, when you don't know any different. I don't know how somebody would be able to make that connection. It just blows my mind.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of it came from, you know, I was also unhappy. You know, I was a unhappy teenager. I was not, you know, some people's personality, I think, trend towards being, not that anyone's okay in that environment, but being a little better off. You know, I talked to friends of mine that grew up in the same cult, and they said, you know, my childhood was generally happy. Like, we believed some crazy things, but my childhood was generally happy. Whereas I was a very unhappy child. I was always in trouble, acting out. And so for me, it was another step of, I think wanting to get away. Yeah. And then, you know, I started this whole sort of track of rebelling, which is really easy to do when everything is controlled, and sort of eventually got to this place where I was being half, you know, in cults or religions, they call it excommunication, half kicked out, and they didn't want me there. They didn't know what to do with me. But at the same time, my parents were very famous, well-known people. They were in the leadership, and I was a third generation. I was actually the oldest third generation. So it was kind of a big deal. My family was a bit of celebrities in the cult, so it was kind of a big deal for me to leave. So they didn't want me to leave. And actually I was 15, so even though it sounds today like I was super brave, like I was a 15-year-old that knew nothing about the real world. So I was pretty scared. Yeah. Like I wanted to go to high school. It was all I wanted was to go to high school, which was a huge crime in the cult, right? It's like saying you wanted to go to a worldly education.
Right.
But that was all I wanted to do. But at the same time, I was freaked out. And my mother actually pulled me aside and, took me for a walk where nobody could hear and was like, look, we have a place for you. We've arranged to send you to a stepsister of mine. My mom at the time was married to an older man. I had a stepsister. I have 24 siblings, okay? So it's all over the place. One of my stepsisters, I'd met her maybe 3 times in my life, and they're like, we're going to send you there. And she was like, are you sure you don't want to go? And it was very much, hint, hint, Daniela, this is your opportunity. Take it. And these days I'm incredibly impressed by her. And I always say that, she wasn't strong enough to get herself out. It took her till she was almost 40 with 8 children of her own to break away from the cult. But she was able at a time that I really needed it to give me the push that I needed. She brought me to Texas. She dropped me off with my sister with $0. So that was fun. But
I hear that.
Definitely had a little bit of help, could not have done it on my own.
So your mom orchestrated that whole thing.
Yes.
That's crazy to me. I mean, that's the bravery that she even portrayed, right? Because, you just mentioned, they're like celebrity. They're very strong, powerful leaders in this organization. And for your mom, and she was born into this too.
And she was born into it too. And also not to mention, let's not forget the belief.
Yeah.
So even while my mom wanted to get me away and knew that there was a better life for me, she 100% believed in the religion, in the beliefs of the cult. It was breaking her heart that I was backsliding from their religion.
Exactly.
Oh, and by the way, I was going to lose contact with all of my family because nobody in the cult could talk to anyone outside of the cult. So it was quite a drastic thing.
It reminds me of like stories that you would like almost like fairy tale sort of things, right? Where like hundreds of years, medieval times, that kind of stuff, where somebody helps someone escape because there's they need that better life or what. It's really it's like a modern day.
Sounds like a really good book that you want to read, right, Brian?
Absolutely.
That's what I hear you say. So
exactly.
Just wait about a year.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. But it's like a modern day story like that of heroics and
absolutely
extreme bravery and stuff like that. So you escaped to Houston, and then what?
Yeah, so great story. So I'm in Houston. I'm 15 years old. I show up. Me and my sister, who also, by the way, never went to school, grew up in this cult, left when she was 25. So she's been out for a year, not even.
So she's still trying to
get
her
she's,
bearings.
she's working at a bar. She's trying to figure out her life. She's got a spare room in her apartment, or a spare bed in her 1-bedroom apartment, and I'm there. And we show up to the high school to enroll me, and literally, Brian, I had a U.S. Social Security card. That was it. I had never been in school for a day, so there's no record of me. I had never had a vaccination or been to a doctor, really. And so I show up like, hey, I want to enroll in high school. And
they're just like, who are you?
They cannot even comprehend. They are like, and I had just moved here from Mexico at the time. So
you're like an undocumented.
So I am like an
essentially.
undocumented child from Mexico, except I'm, super white with blonde hair down to my waist. And they literally said to me, okay, we cannot enroll you in high school because you don't exist. all evidence to the contrary standing in front of them.
Like, we see
you don't exist.
We
So
hear
yes,
you,
so it's really
but
fun to be told you don't exist.
we have no records.
But then they said, but now that we know that you exist and, we have your address here, you need to come back with proof that you're enrolled somewhere in 5 days. Otherwise, we have to call the cops. It's the law.
Yeah. Truancy or something.
And again, here's me just standing there. So basically I ended up having to go, me and my sister, navigating this on our own, like having to go all the way up to the like Houston school district level to, be in front of the right person and be like, this is a 15-year-old child who is begging to go to school.
Yeah.
There is a way to put her in school.
Mm-hmm.
And, it ended up being this process. I, finally got into school about 6 weeks before the end of what should have been my sophomore year, but was really my first day of high school ever.
The first day of school ever.
First day of school ever. Right. Absolutely.
Let alone high school.
Had to, take like 22 tests to test out of everything to try to end up still graduating at 18, not at 20. Kind of the funny hearkening back to Mexico. So I guess whatever admin was putting in my paperwork was like Daniela from Mexico with no records. Okay, put her in English as a second language homeroom. And so I walk in there, which was totally fine with me.
Did you grow up speaking, is that your native language? Or
I grew up speaking English in a vacuum of English-speaking countries. So I had what I call the international kid accent.
Okay, sure.
But I also spoke Portuguese and I also spoke Spanish.
Okay.
And so like I said, I had no problem. And in fact, I probably actually fit in better with the Mexican kids that are in the English as a second language class than I did with the sort of normal American children. But yeah, it was just another funny story. So I was handed a schedule and they said, go to class. And by the way, it was a small high school of only about 4,000 students.
That was bigger than my town growing up.
Yes. So it was a giant inner city Houston high school. And there was, oh my God, so many moments. But let me tell you one, the first test I had to take, they give me this thing. It's called a Scantron. And
Scantron, yeah.
I can figure it out. There's bubbles and I color them in. And so a few days later, we get our test results back and I have a 0. And I'm like, what? And I go to talk to the teacher, and I filled it out with pen. You, of course, have to use a pencil for the machine to read it. I'm trying to explain, like, it's not even that I didn't know that. It's that I didn't even know how to ask the question about what I did wrong. Because the teacher's just looking at me like, you idiot. Why did you fill out a Scantron with a pen? Like, you're just being a rebellious 16-year-old. And so it literally, we would just go around in these circles and I will never forget my first day of school ever. I'm standing in a hallway and, 4,000 students are walking by and I somehow zeroed in on this one pair of students having a conversation. What I would today say was just like a discussion or a debate, a logical back and forth. Well, what about this? Well, what about this? And, I'm from a world where you don't argue. You take everything on faith and you believe it. And as a child, if you ask too many questions, you get in a lot of trouble. And so logic and debate was completely foreign to me. And I just stood there thinking, I've been thinking of myself as Daniela from Brazil, or I'm from a different country. And in that moment, I was like, I'm from another planet.
Interesting. So, so how did you, eventually you made that transition, right? Couple of bumps, a couple of bumps in the road, that sort of thing. But, at what point did you know that, you made that transition from Children of God to successfully getting into and going through high school?
At no point. That will come years later. We'll get to that.
Sure.
I will say that there was some things, even when you talked about, you can't understand coming from that background and, having sort of certain personality traits. And I think, everything a lot of things always harken back to socialization of
Sure.
the group that you come from or where you were born.
Constructs.
And exactly.
Everything is a construct.
And
God, I can't
one
say
of
that enough.
the things that we grew up with, and I would say has been a benefit in my life, although of course there are psychological downsides, is that we were taught that we were the best, right? We were God's chosen people. We were special. So even though, I would never wish that life on anyone, what really benefited me as a 15-year-old by myself trying to navigate the world was nobody ever had to teach 15-year-old Daniela to believe in herself. I showed up with, I'm going to be a straight A student. I showed up with, I'm going to go to college.
Yep.
I don't know how, but I'm going to go to college and I'm going to figure it out. And so, it's very, it's interesting. And you and I, Brian, have talked about this too, that for motivated people, all you need is for someone to tell you that you're going to fail. And I felt that about 10,000 people were not just waiting for me to fail, but wanting me to fail. The 10,000 people in the cult, so they could be like, see what happens. And so I had drive.
There's like nothing better than being able to like prove all the doubters, all the haters wrong, right? And be like, look,
Exactly.
if you don't love me when I'm there, you can't love me when I'm here. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. And then, I would also like to talk about, there was this moment that I realized the benefits of the hardship that I gone through or the story that I had. And this has now remained true for the rest of my life. And so I mentioned I wanted to go to college. I had zero money. I was working for minimum wage, 40 hours a week, supporting myself. And so I was going to join the Marines, which you will appreciate.
I do appreciate that.
So that was my idea. I want to be a badass. I'm going to join the Marines, and they're going to help me pay for college.
Right.
And I was talking to recruiters, and I was doing all that. And then one day in high school, in English class, we had to write our college entrance essay.
Okay.
And you had to write it as a paper for English class, even if you weren't planning to go to college.
Sure.
Which is literally the best thing that ever happened to me. Cool. And the prompt of that essay was, what makes you different?
And you can't think of anything.
Nothing. No. So I'm sitting there going, what do I write about? Do I write about the fact that I have 24 siblings? Do I write about the fact that I live on my own? Do I write about the fact that, oh, hey, I was raised in a cult, which ended up being the title of my essay. But a friend of mine sitting next to me, who, I would help her with her English homework, and she was the perfect, all-American cheerleader. From the outside has, what seems to me as this wonderful, charmed existence. And she could not think of a single thing to write
Because she's
about.
like everybody else.
What makes her different?
She's a cookie cutter.
And interestingly enough, she had something. We decided to write about her living through her uncle dying of cancer. But it was kind of this very interesting moment for me when I realized, oh, hey, there's something about me that makes me different, and that's going to end up being a benefit, which it turned into in two ways. So, of course, there's money. And, in fact, I ended up getting, several different packages, like $24,000 of independent scholarships to go to college. And the other thing was that it got the attention of the right people. And so in high school, that was the high school counselors and the high school principal. And by the way, 100% of those scholarships I got, they applied me to.
Oh, sweet.
Because I had no idea of the process of going to college.
Awesome.
And so, my high school counselor, which to this day still impresses me because she had 1,000 students, she read my essay, she took me under her wing, and she basically forced me into college.
That's amazing.
And so, so it turned out I was like, cool, I got 24 grand, I'm going to college. And then I went to college and realized it costs a lot more than 24 grand.
Exactly. It's just a bit. But it's a good start. Like, let's be honest. Like, that's, that's a good chunk of money to start, making your way through school. But I think you touched on something that was pretty interesting, though, right? Like, you say, hey, I realize I'm different, right? A lot of kids, a lot of high school kids, maybe they've got insecurities about that sort of thing. Or they take it as a point of pride. But it's one of those things where, I can't say this enough, but, everyone's unique. Everyone is their own set of moments and their reactions right, to those moments. Everyone has their own set of their unique experiences. You know, who you are today or who you were in high school are different people because you're evolving and you're shifting every single day, right, depending on which decision you make and where you wind up and all that stuff. You know, there are a lot of people that want so badly or think they want so badly to be like everybody else. And if they're different, like they maybe a lot of times they can take that as an insecurity or like, God, you know, like, oh, I'm different. Why can't I be like everybody else? But when you realize being different's fucking awesome, and being different means you stand out and you can do things. You know, you can do things that normal people can't do, and you realize how much power is in that. I think that's when you start winning the game, right? Winning the game of life or whatever, however you want to say it. I don't give a shit. But you know what I mean? Like it's a pretty incredible insight you got at a young age.
Yeah, you know, there's this great comedian I love, Catherine Ryan, and it's interesting to me that comedians are actually political activists, right?
Oh, sure.
Like that's their
totally.
real power.
Yeah, totally.
But she says, you know, a lot of people want to be normal, but there's no such thing as normal. There is only ordinary.
Exactly.
And
That's
I love
right.
it. I love it. But, you know, so let's fast forward through college. You know, college was, of course, an incredible time, and I learned to sort of develop my mind and ask questions.
Sure.
But to get to your point of when I really felt I was kind of through the transition, and I've been, first of all, transitioning my whole life.
Sure.
I'm kind of a unintentional transition expert, and I think it takes about 6 years minimum to just get through a major life transition. So think about right around the age you're ready to send your kid off to school. Took you about 6 years to transition into being a parent.
Yep. Then it changes all over again.
Or, you know, for me it was leaving the cult, getting through 2 years of high school, 4 years of college, and I couldn't believe that I was going to have a college degree. And I definitely felt this like, I've done it. I've made it. And I felt this like awe. Yeah. And, you know, I was graduating valedictorian from college, and I, you know, was giving this speech, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next with my life. And now I look back and I realize I had no freaking clue of how to operate on my own without an institution. But at the time I felt like I was so successful at this transition. I owe so much to the United States of America and to the American dream. And I'm going to go join the military.
Nice. And so you joined the Marines?
No, because by then I wasn't that crazy, so I joined the Army.
Well, we can't all be perfect. It's all good. So, but for real though, like, I mean, listeners, check this out. Like, no education. She started education at 15 and graduated college as valedictorian. Like, how the fuck is that even possible? You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, you don't got to get into that too much, but like, I'm just like...
No, it's very simple. Let me tell you. There is no end to what a child who's denied an education will achieve.
Yeah, I guess so.
So there's a very, or I should say what they're driven to pursue as far as education. So there's a very good book out now called Educated. And she, you know, another version of grew up in a crazy family that denied her an education, and she went through and got a PhD.
Wow.
I'm actually going back for my PhD next year.
Sweet.
And, you know, in college, like, I wasn't skipping class. Are you crazy? I knew exactly.
I skipped a lot of class.
And most people do. And I mean, it literally took me till junior year of college to relax enough to like think that if I missed one day of class, my world wasn't going to implode.
Right.
Like, I was so viscerally aware of what, first of all, every class was costing me $53. That was a lot to me. You know, I wasn't missing that. And I valued it. You know, I didn't see a class as something horrible. I was like, and first of all, I majored in literature, and I was like, I get to read books, which I was never allowed to do growing up. I get to go to class and discuss books. I get to have the opposite point of view of my professor, and they encourage me.
Isn't that crazy?
And they stimulate my mind. This is awesome. You know? So college was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. And, you know, when you do what you love, it's easy to be good at it.
Absolutely. Nice. So you kicked ass in school. you joined the Army. What happened with this? I want to talk about that point where you're like, this clicked. You made that transition.
Yeah, so, at the time, like I said, I described it as, I still always had this lingering kind of like 9/11 was one of my first experiences of it being introduced to America. So, of course, I have this very, visceral feeling of I'm an American. There are terrorists out there trying to attack America. I also have this, like, I owe this debt to the American dream. I need to pay something back. And I found out about the Army Officer Program, which says, so, first of all, let's caveat and say I was graduating with a degree in English literature in 2009. So I wasn't going to get a job anyways.
The peak of the Great Recession at that point. Yeah.
So, I found out about the officer program where they're going to pay me $45,000 starting.
Which is more than you can make as a teacher.
Right, which is more than any of my friends were making coming out of
Yeah.
college, even the computer science kids at that time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they're going to train me. And I'm going to do 3 years and then I can leave. And then, like, the way I saw it is like, at that point, I will have paid my debt to America and then I can go just be awesome for the rest of my life.
Nice.
Now, knowing what I know and as much time as I've spent thinking about and studying and teaching about socialization and group behavior and all of that, I was institutionalized. I grew up in an institution, and while college was about free thinking, there's still a structure to college. You sign up for a class, you have advisors, they tell you what to do and where to go. I think back now, if I hadn't joined the military after college, I don't know that I would have known what to do. I don't know that I would have known how to just like go out and get a job or figure out what I wanted to be or any of the things that I've done now since leaving the military. So I went into the military and, again, this is where my kind of personal drive comes in and my desire to be the best, because I was like, okay, I'm going to join. In college is graded on grades, so I need to have a 4.0, and the military, in my mind, was graded on physical fitness. So I better quit chain smoking and go become a runner. And I will say by the time I got to basic training, I could run 6-minute miles. So that is kind of my level of drive.
That's solid,
sometimes
yeah.
good, sometimes bad. But in that situation, it worked out for me. So I get off the bus at basic training. And if you've ever served in any branch of the military, you'll know this experience. Basically, you get off the bus, you have a bunch of heavy duffel bags. There's a bunch of drill sergeants yelling at you. It's always in the rain. I think they plan it like that. I think they just wait for a day in the rain. And in the Army, at least, you spend about an hour holding your duffel bags, 2 huge duffel bags, over your head and getting yelled at. So this is me standing there holding about 100 pounds up over my head, getting yelled at. And I just was standing there going,
What the hell did I do?
what did I just do with my life? I just graduated from college valedictorian. Why am I here? I just joined another cult. And that was my moment in basic training. And I think we all go through that moment in the military, right? Which that's exactly what, in fact, basic training or boot camp or whatever each branch calls it is designed to do, right? It's designed to take individuals, break
everyone down
your
to the lowest common
constructs,
denominator,
your
right?
socialization, and build you back up as a team. So, and honestly, once I kind of realized that, or once I got used to it and also just resigned myself because I wasn't going anywhere for 3 years, basic training became really easy for me because it was like, getting up before dawn, standing in line, never being alone, getting yelled at, having to like deal with like physical pain and mental pain and emotional pain was run of the mill for me. So again, this was another time of advantage for me where there was a lot of wonderful, wonderful people that have joined the military. But for most of them, that's their first time leaving home, their first time dealing with any real sort of hardship. Not for everyone by far, but for many people. And so it was, certainly for me, a bit easier. Not to mention I was, 22 years old with a college degree to the average age of 17. So.
Yeah, let me tell you about my initial boot camp experience.
Oh, man.
So I was a bit of a rebel, right? Like I wanted to be a rock star in high school. I got accepted to one of the best music schools in the country, probably the world, whatever. I didn't go. I spent a semester at Central Michigan, and then I joined the Marines because I was just fucking bored. when I got off that bus for like the first week. No, probably about the first like day-ish, probably less than a day. You know, I'm standing at attention and they're like barking down your face. You know, they've got their finger and their index finger and their thumb just like, you know, like this close together and just right in your face. They're like, right? And I'm just standing there at attention, just like smirking and fucking trying not to laugh. Because I'm like, what the fuck am I actually, what is this? I might just take this guy seriously. And they wiped the smile off my face real quick.
Oh, yeah. They tried. I will say that my drill sergeants failed miserably at breaking me from the habit of saying yes, sir, and yes, ma'am.
Uh-huh.
You say that to officers, by the way, for all the listeners. You don't say that to drill sergeants. However,
we said that in Marine
I
Corps
spent
boot camp.
15 years of my life saying yes, sir, and yes, ma'am to everyone, every day, all the time. And yeah, they definitely socialized me into the Army, but it took me quite a long time to learn to not say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am to every sergeant major that scared me, even
Right.
once I was an officer.
Yeah. That's funny. Oh, man. I remember the specific moment that I was in. Like, you know, because I went from being this rebel kid, you know, this punk. I was a punk, right? I was a punk rocker, all that stuff. Having a hard time taking this thing too seriously. So Marine Corps boot camp is 13 weeks. This is probably about 6 weeks in. There was a guy in my boot camp platoon that literally pissed his pants on the squad bay. Or not the squad day, on the parade deck. Because we were out there drilling for like 5-6 hours that day. And they didn't let us use the bathroom. But I think it was the same guy. So this guy was like super out of shape. And the drill instructors were like, fuck this. We're going to get him in shape. So he calls me and 2 other guys and this guy up to the front. And they're just like, you got to do fucking push-ups, right? However they said it. Like, oh, push-ups. And we had to go as hard and as fast as we could. And we could not stop until this guy couldn't take any more. And, you know, it was this breaking point for him because he thought he couldn't do anymore. But yet, you know, he thought he couldn't do anymore. The drill instructors were trying to get him to quit, trying to get him to give up. And that was when I was at this point where I'm like, you are not fucking quitting. Let's fucking go. And like just pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And finally he had this breakthrough moment where he was able to satisfy the drill instructors. And that was my breakthrough when I was like, you know what? I'm a fucking leader. I'm in. And I went from being this like punk fucking rebel kid to like falling in line and being one of the top recruits in my unit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fucking crazy.
And you know what's so interesting to me about that story, Brian, is that, okay, I will say that a lot of the Children of God cult survivors end up going into the military afterwards. Because that's one thing that, you know, kids without a great education but with a lot of drive can do and be successful at.
Sure.
But most of us report kind of the opposite moment, right? Where we all have that experience where it's going on. It is evangelical level of holy rolling, shouting, physical activity, blah, blah, blah. People are crying. There's American flags flying, right? Toby Keith is singing. Like,
yes.
You know, we all have these moments. And
Proud
us
to
cult
be-
survivors, we're looking around going, oh, this is the brainwashing.
Yes, that's exactly what
And,
it is.
you know, so one of the interesting things for me with my experience in the military was they never quite got me.
Yeah.
I served for 6.5 years. I went to war twice. I was an officer. I was a leader. Super proud of my service. Did all this stuff, which we'll talk about. But I never just like bought in hook, line, and sinker.
Wow.
In fact, I went specifically into military intelligence, which is one of the reasons I had to run so fast because it was a competitive branch. But my job, I was the expert on the bad guy. So my job was literally for the colonel or the general to say, you know, we're going to go take this village. And it was my job to look at them and be like, sir, you're going to die. Here's all of the things you're not thinking about.
Yeah.
So it was my job to be devil's advocate.
Yeah.
And I think that's the only reason. I was very good at that, by the way. I was very good at being devil's advocate, very good at seeing the other perspective, which, you know, as I'm like sort of writing and telling my whole life story, I'm like, oh, like, you know, when I left the cult and I had to learn about how to be a normal American person, like now I have to go to Afghanistan and learn all about, you know, how the Al-Qaeda terrorists are thinking,
Yep.
you know, and it's, of course, two very different groups of people, but it's just another research project. Like, I just need to go
Totally.
and learn. So this ability to kind of be like, I don't understand how these people think, but I can immerse myself in it and learn it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's been, you know, another outcome
Yep.
interesting outcome that I've seen from my life.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You know, just the studying of cultures and people and stuff like that, right? Like, I think we kind of share something like that in a sense. You know, like with my travels, but even in America, you know, I grew up in Michigan, but I lived in San Diego, Las Vegas, Boston, New York, L.A. I've been in Seattle for a couple of months. In every place that I've been, you know, I've had to rebuild my network, right? So every time you're rebuilding your network, you're meeting people, that kind of thing. You've got to study those little microcultures, right?
Right.
Those subcultures of America. So, you know, as easily as people can be like, oh yeah, we're fucking all Americans, we're all the same. That's not true. That's not the case.
And, you know, the people that are the super connectors and are the kind of powerful people that can go anywhere. You know, I'm similar like you, Brian. I can go anywhere and build a community around myself.
Right.
In anywhere, you know, and it's because you become a chameleon.
Yeah.
You know, and because for me, I grew up without ever having to learn to relate to anyone because we were all the same. We all, no matter where we moved in the world, we all had the same life. We just fit into another little commune, which is the same reason military people love other veterans, right? Because you find out two pieces of information about them and you
you're like,
immediately
boom,
have a
click.
connection.
Yep.
But people that fit in well in any culture, any society, are like learn to be chameleons, right? And learn that everyone has a story and everyone loves their culture,
Sure.
right? And so if you talk to people about their culture and you learn about their culture, you know, of course, it's not the same experience as being one of them, but you can
appreciate
you can
it.
be accepted in those groups, and you learn so much about socialization, about how we think. You know, so these days, it's one of the things I actually do is teach classes on building community. Look, everywhere you go, you know, I teach for military women and military spouses, and you know, it's easy for people to say, for example, oh, we don't have a support network because we're here away from all of our family. And I'm like, you know, I moved to Washington 4 years ago, and my husband and I spend a night out once a month without our toddler because
Once a month.
she's with someone in our network that we have built
Exactly.
actively and intentionally built a network around us. Next year, we're moving to Houston, and I already have a spreadsheet for all of the different types of people that I need to make connections with for the transition plan for my family.
Nice.
Because we are moving to a new culture, to a new place, and even though it's Houston and that's where I went to high school, it's been a minute, and
Yeah.
so we got to go back and we got to reintegrate, you know?
Yeah, and you know, like, I just want to finish this point really quick, but like, you know, when I say like, oh, you know, the different subcultures are different, I'm not saying bad, right? Like, I'm not a believer in black and white. I'm not a believer in good or bad necessarily. I think, you know, I think most people at their core, they all want the same stuff, right? They want a good life. They want to, you know, make a little bit of money to take care of themselves and take care of their families and whatever else. And, you know, the differences are more in the details on how they go about it, right? Or the types of relationships they build or whatever else.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, you're on the same page with that, right? I'm wondering, like, as you've been doing this research, right, the research into the American culture, the military, and then Afghanistan with the intelligence, how did that translate? So you're doing this research stuff, but how did that translate when you're, you know, looking at Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan?
Yeah, you know, so I definitely agree with you, like you said, and I think that actually as humans we get into trouble when we try to put everything in black and white, right? Nothing's all good, nothing's all bad. And one of the things I say these days a lot is that, you know, people ask me all the time, like, how did 100,000 people get sucked in by this cult, right? Well, cults do some things right. Human beings want community.
Yep.
They want love. They want connection. They want purpose. And that's what organizations like cults, like the U.S. military, and like many other organizations do very, very well.
Yep.
And in fact, that's one of the things I do today with business leaders. It's like, I say, you can't spell culture without cults, okay? Everything you
so
need
true.
to do to build this strong, amazing culture that you want, that motivates your people, has downsides to it.
Yep.
So how are you protecting against those downsides? So for me, it was very interesting in Afghanistan doing what I did with intelligence. So, because on the one hand, I'm an American soldier, and I am, getting attacked by these terrorists or seeing other people attacked by these terrorists and, hearing reports of people all of the time. My entire team that I was patrolling with pretty much was killed on one mission. And so I very much am viscerally connected to that. At the same time, I have this ability to kind of disassociate myself with that and still realize why the terrorists want to do that, right? And so it goes back to that religious extremist. They're religious extremists, but they believe they're right. That's all they know.
Right.
And in fact, several different moments where I would hear, my counterparts describing, the Afghans as animals because they would be planting roadside bombs with a 2-year-old in their arms as a shield against, whatever the Americans have in the sky. Or as inhuman because their kid gets blown up on the street and they come 3 hours later to the base to ask for money. But that's also the world. Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires. Afghanistan has been at war for as long as human beings have existed.
Yeah.
And so if my child went out on the street in America and got blown up, a lot of people's lives would be destroyed. Not just me and my husband, right?
Right.
Everyone that knows my kid would be like, what the hell? For them, that's Tuesday. So it's not that it's any less horrible when that happens to them, but they are socialized that just happens.
It's a little more
you just
numbing.
recover. You move on. It's not different than, 19th century America where you had 12 children because you wanted 6 of them to grow up.
Right.
Right? So it's the way that we act is very much determined by socialization. And, I will say for me, and this is essentially the crux of the article that I have published, which is at that funeral, when my colleagues, my very good friend had been blown up, horrible event, 10 people were killed. But, we're standing on the airline and we're watching the coffins being loaded and the generals are saying all of the words that they say when soldiers are killed, right? That they died fighting for what they believe in. They died on the right side of history. That they're amazing men. And while part of me, of course, felt that and still does to this day, the other part of me just had this thought that, the guys that killed them, they think the opposite. They think that they're on the right side of history.
Yep.
They think that the people that they lost are heroes and martyrs and are going to heaven and are doing the right thing.
Yep.
And it was such this moment for me of being able to understand that really no one person's better than any other person.
Right.
These people that joined a terrible cult aren't any different than, and in fact, they've done studies to bear this up, that there's no one type of person that joins a cult, right?
Sure. Right.
It's just you are a product of what you know, and you only can possibly believe the things that you're surrounded by, which is, a reason that diversity is so important and having discussions with people that think differently from you is so important. And that all 100% came into play in doing intelligence operations in a war zone.
It's interesting. You're talking about, both sides thinking that they're doing what's right. I mean, essentially that's why wars are fought, because both sides are so firm in their beliefs, right? Just kind of reminds me of my travels through Vietnam. So, I don't know, a couple years ago, I spent a few weeks back in Vietnam. And, the people are fucking amazing. Like, they're so nice. They're so friendly. They love Americans, right? Even though we had that whole debacle 40 years ago or whatever it was. In Saigon and Hanoi, they have these war memorial museums, right? I went to this one in Saigon. I went to two in Hanoi. One was the war remnants, something or other. I'll have more details when I'm sharing my story. But there was one that was like the War Remnants Museum. The other one was the Hanoi Hilton, where like John McCain and all these other guys with these POWs were held. And the thing that really blew my mind there was, from an American perspective, I'm like, the propaganda here is ridiculous, right? Because it's all about, oh, we treated the American POWs so well, but the Americans treated our people like shit, and like, we're on the right side of history and all that stuff, right? And when I was seeing that stuff, I was like, it hit me that whoever wins gets to tell the story, right?
Exactly.
And of course you're going to put yourself in the good light. And again, nothing black or white, so I don't want to get into the politics of Vietnam. But it made me realize that every piece of history that America tells, it's all fucking propaganda too. It's the same shit.
It is. It so is, and in the military, from like, doing cadences where we're shouting, kill, 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 rage. Like, this is brainwashing. This is propaganda.
Giving the enemy derogatory names.
Right. And to the flip side,
Dehumanizing
right,
them.
of in intelligence, and this was actually something like as a leader, as the chief of intelligence and all that, like I had to work really hard with my own team.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were saying, like, no, we don't use derogatory names. Like, no, we don't all this stuff, because in fact, one of the biggest dangers that the American military has in the wars that we're fighting now is underestimating the enemy, right? Thinking that Muslim culture is backwards, thinking that terrorists are stupid, thinking that, first of all, that those two things are one and the same, and all of these things. Like, if you don't respect your enemy, they are going to get you. And these people are much more hardcore than we are. Like, let's face it, So it really, really behooves us to, like I mentioned earlier, think like them. You have to think like the opposite side, which can be very, very hard to do. And, like we mentioned, we're avoiding politics, but I'm sure we can all immediately think of what side of the political spectrum we are on right now. And I have a hard time. I can't relate to the other side. But it's worth trying, right? And it's worth listening to.
Yep. Because if you can't have the conversation with somebody from an objective perspective, just to kind of like learn like what makes them tick or whatever, then there's never going to be any middle ground made. There's never going to be a sense of understanding. And if you don't have that sense of understanding, then you're essentially just digging your heels in, and you're getting ready to defend yourself and fight the other side. Whether that's U.S., Afghanistan, whether that's the political climate right now, whether any of that stuff.
Right.
If you don't spend the time to say, hey, we differ on how we think about things. Why do you think like that?
Yeah.
Share this with me. I'm not trying to attack. I just want to understand.
Exactly. And it's okay. So one thing is, you always think your idea is right. Of course you do. That's why you have that idea.
Exactly.
The second you didn't think it was right anymore, you would change ideas.
Right.
So it's totally okay to be opinionated. It's totally okay to be passionate. But it's not okay to not listen to the other side and consider the other side. And so, for me, with my entire experience in the military, like, I'm not trying to offend anyone. I'm not trying to say that America isn't on the right side of history or that we are fighting for the wrong thing.
Right, of course.
Who knows? Fighting war is wrong in general. Let's, most likely.
Yeah.
So
we're a couple of hippie veterans.
If we're not, I know, right? But if we're not constantly questioning why we're there, what we're doing, and learning and knowing and respecting what the other side is thinking. And by respecting, I don't mean you have to be like, oh, yes, this is a valid opinion.
Right.
But you have to respect that they see it as a valid opinion.
Exactly.
And that's why people every time you try to convince people that their religion is wrong or their politics are wrong or whatever, it doesn't work, right?
No.
Because to them, it is a valid opinion.
Exactly.
And when you come at them like it's not a valid opinion, you're immediately on opposing sides.
Well, and it's just like what we were talking about earlier. Like, what happens when someone tells you can't do something or you're wrong?
Right.
You're going to do everything
you wanna do
humanly
is do
possible
it.
to prove them wrong, right? If you're saying, "Oh, hey, the clothes you wear are not right," or your opinion on this religion or that is not right. What are people going to do? They're going to get pissed off. These are closely held beliefs and values that they have, right? And it's part of who they are. And if you tell somebody that part of who you are isn't valid or it's wrong, like, what greater insult can you give somebody? You know what I mean? Of course they're going to get fucking pissed.
Right.
That's just kind of my thought on that. But where else? Where are we at? Let's
Should we go to war?
go to war.
Talk about that?
I want to talk about this. Let me talk about your time in Afghanistan, your 2 tours,
Yep.
leading.
So my first deployment, I deployed pretty much right after I commissioned. I went to intelligence training. I requested the 101st because I wanted to, make sure I got to war before it was over.
Airborne, right?
Which is funny. Yes. And I was in an aviation unit, so think, Army helicopters.
Mm-hmm.
And I went overseas to Afghanistan, to Kandahar for a year. And so my sort of like my day job or my regular job was I was, a lieutenant in intelligence in the brigade headquarters. And I did a lot of stuff with collections, assets. So think, eyes in the sky, security operations. We were the group that was in charge of like sort of any down helicopters. At the same time. So this is 2011 to 2012. And this is right when behind the scenes is raging a debate about women in combat. And there's still, in 2011, there is still a combat exclusion, which says that women are not allowed to be in combat.
Right. I mean, it's basically been like that as long as America's been around.
Yeah, it was like they had to, I just learned this recently, they had to make a switch to allow women to pilot helicopters. And so part of the whole political negotiation of that was we're going to put an exclusion for ground combat.
Okay.
So to make everyone tolerate women in helicopters more, we're going to say they can't be in ground combat. So, and to be very, very clear, in no way was I ever one of the first women operating on the ground, right?
Sure,
so
right.
there have been women fighting in every conflict, fighting on the front lines in every conflict since the Revolutionary War.
Really?
Every single one. There have always been. There's historical documentation of all of it.
And we're not talking like Mulan type fighters, right?
No. They check you to make sure you're what sex you are what gender you are before you enter the military. So you can't pretend.
Yeah, I didn't know.
No,
that,
but there have been, so certainly in the Revolutionary War, there was still a lot of women dressing up like men to go do things. But there just always have been. But it's always been under the carpet. It's been behind the scenes, and it's been, most harmfully brushed over. So there's several things from the perspective of these women. One is, we deserve the right to compete for our roles just like any man does, and to have everything that we're capable of us open to us. And by the way, we're capable of all of it, as we've now proven.
Right.
The second thing is that women were doing this, but they were not getting essentially the credit for doing it, right? So there's several instances of like suicide bomb went off, and the male guard who got killed got cited as, death in combat or killed in action, and the female guard gets citations as, killed while supporting combat actions.
I wonder why you think that would be.
It's because it was
the politics of it?
Yeah, because it was illegal for her technically to have been in
right.
combat. And the thing is that law was made back when there was still more traditional warfare with front lines, right? And so, the way it broke down to the Army was in any kind of combat unit, women couldn't be, even once they started integrating them, women couldn't be lower than like the brigade level, because that was considered tactical line unit, even though nothing about this war operate it that way at all.
Right.
So, you know, and then from the perspective of the military, people love to say like, oh, the military is not your social proving ground. Like this is not, we don't need to risk lives so that we can make you feel good or equal or whatever, you women. Well, the thing is, you know, we've already talked about this, the diversity of perspective. Of course, you know, it seems so simple to us nowadays, now that we've integrated all combat arms and we've had such success, that of course you want the perspective of the other 50% of the population in something as serious as life and death war fighting. But at the time, we were focusing on, can women be, for 250 years, we had the argument, can women be as big and strong as men?
Right.
And we finally started putting us into combat, we realized we don't need us to be as big or strong as men. We need us to be women because we bring something else to the table.
Sure.
So I was in Kandahar and they wanted volunteers. So basically, back up at Congress, they're still saying no, the American people can't take, you know, a story of a mother being killed overseas. The commanders on the ground are saying we need women because we're fighting an insurgency, which means we're not fighting the Afghan people. We're fighting the terrorists on their homeland. We need the Afghan people to support us and not them.
Right.
And so in order to do that, we can't be trampling all over their culture.
Right.
We need to respect their culture. And their culture says that men can't touch women. Men can't search women. So essentially the first experiments with this were putting women onto combat teams, pairs of 1 or 2 women onto combat teams just as an attachment. And this started happening for what we considered to be non-combat missions, you know, way back in the 2000s, as soon as this conflict started.
Yeah.
However, in 2010, 2011, the Marines started first and then the Army followed the next year, was when the commanders on the ground said, no, we need women attached to every deliberate operation. So deliberate operations are going out for a combat mission, guns blazing, expecting to encounter, you know, expecting to take an objective, expecting to capture people, you know, with that being the mission, right? To take this village, take this whatever, capture this person, and we need women. And, you know, the crazy thing about it is we were doing it completely unprepared. So we had 40 hours of training, cultural sensitivity training. We had about 2 days of, you know, we showed up to the unit and the guys were like, so you want to be in the infantry? All right. We're going to make you bleed. And once we proved ourselves, we were part of the team, right? Sure. But then what the military realized very quickly was now the danger is, you know, these men, by saying like women can't be in combat units, all we're doing is keeping them from being trained, right? So not only getting the training, right, the patrol training, the combat training, but also getting to train with your team.
Yeah.
You know, this team, so I was attached to a team that was called the Pathfinders, and they're these guys that are super highly skilled, super trained, they're rangers, they're all this other stuff, and they're attached to an aviation unit to deploy within 10 minutes or less to the site of any downed aircraft, cut the aircraft apart, rescue or recover all souls on board, and then bring everything and all sensitive equipment back home. Okay. So that was their kind of highly specialized mission. In the meantime, and fortunately because we didn't have a lot of downed aircraft in Afghanistan compared to other wars, they were a highly trained infantry force, and so they would do other patrols. And so I was, you know, given the opportunity to be a part of that. And I would say, even though it was very thrilling at the time, like, I knew it was a big deal. Like, I came home and I remember being like, after my first mission, being like, I was in a fighting position, pointing my weapon at potential enemy, my loaded weapon. And my friend was like, well, was there any enemy there? And I was like, no, but that's not the point.
Exactly.
The point is I was there on purpose. I wasn't there because a convoy got interrupted. Right. I wasn't there because of a random attack. Like, I was there on purpose, sent by a general into this mission.
Yeah.
Which of course ended up, you know, for brevity's sake, let's just say, you know, so in 2011 we were doing this. In 2013, the combat exclusion was actually repealed by Secretary Pineda. And then in 2015, I believe, the first 2 female rangers were qualified. And in July of 2019, the first 4-star female general took over an infantry division as the commander.
Big ups.
You know, and
huge.
And again, very, very quickly, we started realizing all these things. So I'll share, a short story that I had, which was we jump off our helicopter, we're going to this village, and there's still like dust everywhere, you can hardly see. And these very highly trained men immediately notice that something is wrong with the ground, right? There's disturbances in the ground. And I, meanwhile, in these same 10 seconds, I'm like, where are all the children? Like, we never approach this village without being swarmed by children. Sometimes we have to shoot weapons in the air to keep them away from our helicopter blades. So where are all the children? Together, we realize that, okay, there's a bomb in the road there. And we're able to put that together very quickly. We're able to respond to it. And nobody is killed that day. We're walking back to the aircraft, and the commander is like, God, I love having women on the team. You guys notice the silliest things, but totally serious, right? Because we had just lost a bunch of people, so we take it very seriously, of course. And it was a real compliment. And, what's interesting was I was telling this story, I was filming something, and I was telling this story, and a special operations soldier was operating the camera. And he kind of said to me afterwards, he was like, really? They didn't notice there was no children there, even though we're briefed about that all the time. And I was like, you just made my story stronger because I know you're briefed about it all the time. I was the intelligence officer. I'm the one that's always telling you if there's no women and children, that's a danger sign.
Yep.
But what we had never realized before was again, we notice different things. Men and women have different life experiences. And what was sort of behind the scenes there is that I noticed that when little Afghan girls see me and realize that I'm a female soldier, which is something completely unheard of in their world, right? Their eyes get wide, they smile, they light up. And so for me in Kandahar, operating in a world where I generally don't see children unless I leave the base, this was a cool moment for me. So I just viscerally noticed that so much faster, literally because I'm a woman. I noticed faster. Would they have gotten there eventually? Probably. But I noticed faster. And together, in 5 or 10 seconds or 1 second can make all the difference in combat when there's a live bomb in front of you, right? So 100%. And this is something that, like I mentioned before, has very quickly become part of combat culture now, right? Is having women on the objective, having women training with the men. And, the benefit even that we had with my team specifically was our commander and the men on the ground were into it. They wanted the women. They knew that not having the women was a handicap. And they constantly reemphasized to us, speak up. If you see anything silly, speak up. I don't think I would have brought it up, where are all the children, if I had been told over and over again, if you see anything that you don't understand, bring it up. Which, these days is one of these things I teach leaders. Hey, when you get new people into your organization and they ask so many questions, it's exhausting. It's like your 4-year-old. That's an advantage to you. If they ask you a question and your answer is just because the way we've always done it, you need to stop. And you need to reassess that process because that's how you're avoiding groupthink, right? And that's how you're avoiding the danger sign. In the military, we understand that we call it 360 degrees of safety. You need to have eyes on 360 degrees around you. Well, if you're only one type of person, there's no physically you can have eyes on 360 degrees.
Oh, sure.
But mentally and psychologically, there's a lot of things you're just not noticing it, and it's just a fact.
That's a couple of interesting points. One is the irony of excluding women for so long. Maybe it's because of historical things they're the ones that bear the next generation, right? Carry the the fetuses or the babies, right? Maybe that's the reason. I think that's the reason, but I don't fucking know. But the irony of excluding women for so long and then realizing how fucking obvious it is. How much sense that makes.
It's also the thing with any kind of social change that the problems people think it's going to be, especially when we talk about diversity, the problems that you think are going to be there are not going to be there.
Right.
You might have other things, but it's not going to be the debates that people have. And so if we look back, and so I always think it's funny when people say the military is not your social proving ground, because in fact the military has always been the social proving ground, has always been in the forefront of cultural change. But if you look back, like, we didn't want to integrate black people into the military, right? We thought that was going to be the end of successful warfare. Then we didn't want to integrate women, and then we didn't want to integrate gay people, and then we didn't want to integrate transgender, which is of course going on right now. And every single time I was on my deployment, same deployment, 2011 was when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. And everyone was freaking out. It was going to break the army, blah, blah, blah. And then you know what happened on September 20th, 2011? Nothing.
Exactly.
Nothing changed.
Exactly.
All of those people, our brothers and sisters that were serving right alongside of us, were the same people they had always been. And allowing people to be who they are openly allows them to bring the benefit of the richness of their experience to the table. And so even, you know, with diversity, even I've coached some leaders that are like, well, I did a bunch of diversity hiring and I have every color of the rainbow at my table, but it hasn't changed anything.
Well, but the thing is, though, is like...
that's on the leader, right? So if you're staffing every position with someone as different in color, you know, you found all the purple squirrels, but you expect them to show up as... with your opinion, toe the party line, or to be kind of the same idea as everyone else, then you're not getting diversity of life experience. You're not getting diversity of opinion.
Exactly.
You know, and so when my infantry commander came on, you know, we were both lieutenants. He's just the one in charge, and he's like, "Hey, Daniela, tell me about yourself." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He was like, "What makes you different?" And it was that same line,
like, oh boy,
that same line from high school. And I was like, all right, we're doing this. But he was one of the first leaders that expressed to me, like, oh my God, like, you have such a different take on everything because of your experience. And by the way, that is useful to me in my combat team. And he literally tasked me, because he asked me, just like you, like, how did you escape from that? How did you even start questioning that group think? And I was like, I don't know, it's just something about me. And so then he kind of tasked me with, okay, Daniela, it is your job to question all of my orders. And he was like, literally, he was like, I mean, when I say get down, bullets are flying, so get down. But ask me why we're going on that mission in the first place, right? It was like, this is your value to me. I want you to question everything. And that turned out to be incredibly, incredibly important to you know, our mission and our team.
Yeah, I mean, so going back to to kind of piggyback on that, like the diversity thing, you know, it's so funny that people, you know, you hear so much about, oh, hey, we got to do diversity hires and all that shit, right? I've known, and I've had people close to my professional circles that are like, oh, I need to hire a black person to get my ratio up, right? And I remember this was happening a year ago with somebody that was pretty fucking close to me. And I'm telling this guy, I'm like, dude, you don't hire a black person because they're fucking black. You hire people based on what's on their mind, you know, based on their fucking skill, their drive, you know, their minds and their hearts. And if they happen to be a person of color, or they happen to be this, that, or the other thing, fucking A.
Yeah.
You know, you want to get that diversity, you know, you want the diversity there, but you can't force that shit. It's got to be natural. You know?
You see, I think that, okay, with diversity, it does have to be intentional, because the thing about the lack of diversity is it's self-perpetuating.
Okay.
Right? So we've all been in military units where everyone looks like everyone else, right?
Yeah.
And if you just think of the typical stereotype of a Marine, right? And that's because human nature is to not like to feel out of place. We don't enjoy feeling out of place.
Right.
So, you know, there's a part of it that needs to be intentional, right? So I think that for leaders, you should have kind of a danger signal. If you walk into your conference room and everybody is one gender or one race or from one part of the country or from only Harvard, right? Like there are companies that do that. That is a danger sign. And so it's important to know, like, yes, I do want to hire more black people. Yes, I do want to hire more women. Yes, I do want to hire disabled people. But like, so it's like that works into your consciousness, but it's, the way I say it for leaders is, look, diversity in your business is not about social justice.
Right.
It's not about these people deserve it.
Right.
That's a great outcome of it, but it's about what do they bring to the table.
Exactly.
You need to hire a Black person because an African American has a completely different life experience than you do as a white man.
Yep.
Right? I have a completely different experience than you do as a man.
Right.
And so, yes, you need to hire, this kind of idea of check the block. Like, yes, you need to have as much diversity around you.
But you got to be smart about it.
But it's how you engage with that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's how you, if we say we want more, and I'm just going to talk about women because obviously I'm a woman. If you just say we want more women, but then when I bring up an example, when I bring up an example, so I've built a whole networking class around a fairy tale that I was listening to with my daughter, and that's the analogy that I use, and it's phenomenal, and people love it. And I can do that because I work for myself. But I don't know if I was still working at, Fortune 500 corporate America, like I did when I got out of the Army, if I would have been like, hey, let me tell you this analogy, and not been laughed out of the room. Right. So if we say we want to hire more women, but we don't want to let them bring the fact that they're a mother, which by the way is incredible leadership training, right, to the table, then we don't really want to hire more women for the potential. We want to hire them so that we look good. And that's what I heard you saying.
That's the point that I was making.
Is that it's...
You don't just hire somebody.
I absolutely agree with the point you're making. It's about what's behind it.
Exactly.
It's about... And so I always explain it to leaders where I said that diversity is not about social justice.
Right.
Diversity hiring is about increasing your profit and decreasing your risk.
Yep.
Right? And that is what we found in the military.
Right.
It wasn't that oh, we answered the question that women can be just as good as men, or this is fair to allow women to, sign up to sacrifice their lives just like the men do. We found out that, women actually make us safer.
Yeah.
Interesting study showed that almost every culture in the world, men hesitate before killing women. Obviously a benefit in combat,
Absolutely.
Right? So nowadays...
Because if you hesitate, you're dead.
Only, 8 years later after they were recruiting me... When I wasn't allowed to have my hair down, I had to be dress in uniform, which, by the way, means I look like a man in uniform with helmet and gloves and everything. Now, that when they recruit special operators and the women, they want you to have long hair. They want you to have your hair down outside of your uniform. They want you to have a headscarf. They want you to not wear your gloves when you're interacting in the village so people can tell you're a woman because... just you being a woman is a safety benefit to that team, and we can play off of that, right?
I mean, even going a little bit deeper on the diversity stuff, like for me, for example, personal anecdote, I know I've got a pretty diverse network, right? Like I've got friends like you that are veterans and do stuff like that. I've got friends that are entrepreneurs and diplomats and people that work in companies, corporate people. Even one of my best friends from high school, he works a fast food job, and that's he's happy doing that, right? But with everybody that I know and everyone that I talk to, I ask them the same questions, right? Because every single person, regardless of social stature or wealth or whatever it is, right, education level, everyone's got their own set of experiences, which means they've got their own frame of reference and their own knowledge base, right? So when we're talking diversity stuff, I think it's super important to talk to anybody and everybody that you possibly can when you're trying to make a decision, for example, because you get different perspectives. And quite often, you talk to one person, you'll hear something one way. You talk to another person, you might hear something completely different. And somebody that you talk to might shine a light on something that's super important that you wouldn't have recognized or realized without having talked to somebody with a life experience like that or that sort of resources. you know?
Well, exactly. And, just from being friends with you, Brian, I've heard you say, when I was living in Beijing, I learned this.
Yeah.
The Chinese people do this way.
Yep.
And so, that's the proof point, right? Like, it's a completely different culture. Yep. And how much of that have you incorporated into your life?
Oh, sure.
Because it is useful and because it is beneficial. And, and the other thing, too, is like, no matter how much we know and how much we study and how much we even engage, you cannot understand. I truly believe you cannot understand the experience of a group that you're not a part of.
Right.
And so, like I talk with my husband about this all the time. Like, he's the most equal-minded, questioning, intelligent, amazing man. But he's a man. He can't understand what it's like to be a woman.
Sure.
And so every once in a while, I will have to say, like, you just have to trust me. Like, this is my experience as a woman.
Yep.
You just have to, I know it doesn't make sense to you, but you just have to trust me. And so, of course, we should all be doing the work to try to become more knowledgeable people.
Right.
Like right now I'm reading only books written by women of color because I'm trying to understand a different life perspective.
Yep.
But like you said, it's not about checking the block and being
Right.
like, I read books of women of color. It's about actually learning
It's
that
not like,
experience.
oh, hey, I'm so woke.
But just because I do that, that doesn't mean I'm now an expert and I don't need a woman of color on my team, right?
Right, exactly.
Like, it still just means, like, that's hopefully so I can understand a little bit better and not unintentionally do things that are awful to women of color. But as I'm building larger and larger teams, I still want to make sure that I have that perspective. And not only that I have it, but I engage that perspective. So you want to give, you want a balance of giving everyone the chance to be just the all-American normal major point of view, because they probably have that too. But then you also want to give them the chance to be like, hey, what do you think differently about this?
A little more nuanced
because
opinion.
of your experience, because of what you have.
Exactly.
And one of my leaders, so this will probably be a good segue, on my second deployment, when I didn't used to, talk a whole bunch about how I grew up in a cult when I was an officer in the Army. Right. And I ended up sharing my background with my battalion commander, this colonel in the Army, and he thought about it. He didn't say anything immediately. He thought about it, and he came back later, and he said, Daniela, do you know the kind of insights that you must have between growing up in that community and then serving in the military, like the kind of insights you must have about culture and leadership and teams and all these other things? And at the time I said no, but I've continued to think about it. And this man has continued to be a mentor. And even as I was starting my business, and almost every other mentor was telling me, don't talk about the cult, just talk about the military, just talk about this amazing stuff you did in war. That's enough. You were captain of the Army. And he was like, no, your life experience is important. And he was like, don't stop there. It's not just the cult. It's not just war. It's the fact that you are an extreme athlete. It's the fact that you are a mother. It's the fact that you are trilingual. And he started listing off all of these other things, like you're an Army wife, like all of these other things that I never would have thought about. And, the funny thing is, now I do speaking and teaching and all this stuff, and I've used examples of everything.
Oh, absolutely.
I have literally used examples of breastfeeding challenges to talk to like a 50-year-old white male CEO about something he's not considering in his operations, and it's this whole person thing. We are, so for that example specifically with that leader, like, I did think about what he said for 5 years now and studied it and all of this. And these days, I can say, Brian, I have 23 years of experiences of being embedded in giant organizations with strong cultures, right? Between my cult time, my military time, and even more when we think like I've been in corporate America, I've been in the nonprofit world, et cetera, et cetera. And, that I never like the term expert, but that makes me a pretty knowledgeable person on this subject,
when it comes
right?
to culture
When
and
anyone
leadership
has 23
stuff,
years of
absolutely.
experience in any field, we give them a lot of credibility and a lot of benefit.
I mean, in some cultures, they would call them a guru, right?
Which is why I love this conversation that we're having, right? Because it's this very intentionally allowing me to be like, connect it back to yeah, when I was 6 years old at the time, I didn't realize this, but now I realize, like, here's
right?
all the factors that were in play. And it's why, you know, I mentioned earlier, now I'm going back to do the PhD and do the doctorate and, you know, put a lot of this stuff into context, create some original research and all of that.
You know, it's kind of like, I guess, to relate it to my own personal experience, you know, after, you know, I had that PTSD-inducing event in the Marines, you know, military sexual trauma. I was, you know, drugged and raped and shit. It was fucking horrible. I still deal with it. But, you know, after dealing with that and then getting a other than honorable discharge as directly related to that and the treatment, I spent the next 15, 17 years, you know, focused on building my own career, determined not to let me see. I spent 17 years building my career trying to hide that as much as possible. Right? All of it. The military stuff, like being a Marine, you know, being a veteran, the whole PTSD situation. I tried to hide that as much as possible because I didn't want it to define me. And it wasn't until I want to say a couple of years ago, maybe a year or two ago, something like that, when I got to this point and I'm like, you know what? It doesn't define me, but it's part of who I am. It's part of my story. And once I decided to start, I hate using the term lean in, but like once I started to own that, once I took ownership of that and I said, you know what? This is my fucking story. You know? Once I started to own that, that's when things started really changing. Things started changing quite a bit.
And that's very much the same experience that I've had, right? Like I was told everything from like, well, your cult story is alienating to people.
Oh, sure.
And once I started sharing that, like, so part of all of the advice that you get from people about like, don't share or don't talk about that, I always think of it as, that's on you, Brian, right? Mm-hmm. And that was on me to share my story in a way that it allows other people to open up and not close off, right? So my cult story has been far from alienating. My cult story has allowed me to connect with so many other people. Mm-hmm. And when I've been telling my story, you know, last year I told my story on the TED stage, and the entire evening after, because it's a big conference, right? It was people just coming up to me and being like, let me tell you about what I went through in regards to this, that, and the other. And so I think, you know, I love the entire idea of this show, right, is everyone has a story to share and everyone has just incredible lessons that they've learned and incredible value that they bring to the table. Mm-hmm. Every story does. And I have what some people like to think of as a really crazy story, but it's not any crazier than anyone else's.
Really crazy story too, man.
It's not any crazier or any more valuable or any worse than anyone else's. Right. It's just different.
Well, that's exactly it, right? It goes back to, you know, there is no black and white. Everything's a fucking construct. Everyone's got their own story. It's not better or worse or whatever. It just is, right?
Right.
And the sooner that you can come to terms with your story, for better or worse in your own mind, the sooner you can come to terms with that and own that shit, I think the sooner you can really become like the whole you, right? Without trying to be too deep or whatever, but you know what I mean?
No, absolutely. And that's when you start seeing how everything connects, right?
Exactly.
It's like we've already mentioned today, like you're a whole person, but you're also a different person.
Right.
And so if you never go back and share those stories, you know, if I had never started sharing my cult stories, you know, I always looked at this as just something hard that I'd overcome. Mm-hmm. I didn't look at it as this entire theme of my life, right? Or entire, you know, like these days, like, yes, I'm a pretty good expert on socialization and group culture and organizations and how they work and how they grow and the good sides and the bad sides and what you can do to build strong culture and how you can avoid building a cult. And I never would have realized all of that value that I bring to the table if I hadn't started sharing my story. And there's power in stories.
I'll tell you what, there's probably no greater power than a good story.
I agree.
To be honest with you.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, Danielle, it's been a great conversation so far. I think we're at a pretty good spot to start kind of wrapping it up here. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about like where you're at now with your story. Things you want to push, things you want to plug, right?
Yeah, so where I'm at now is I left the military about 4 years ago. I'm married to a, active duty special operations helicopter pilot,
He's
which
badass.
is, yeah, he's badass. It's fun. It's scary.
You're pretty badass too,
I'm
let's be
literally
honest.
an expert in everything that can go wrong with all of his missions.
God.
So it's quite fun. We have a beautiful 3.5-year-old who we're raising in, like you mentioned, 3 languages, which is a very, very cool, interesting cultural experiment.
Yeah.
For me, other than just the, of course, intelligence and language benefits for her. And I worked for corporate America a little bit, and then I started doing my own thing a few years ago. And I realized I wanted to be a speaker. I realized that I love teaching adults innovative things in innovative ways, and that I can bring a lot of value to the table in that.
Nice.
So these days, I'm a member of a really cool company called Cavness HR, and it's a virtual HR firm for small businesses. So basically, you don't need a full-time HR person. You do need full-time HR coverage. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong and can bankrupt a small business. So the average cost to a business for every HR incident is $10,000 per employee for a year. So if you think you have, if you have 10 employees and you have one issue, that could cost you $100,000. So we come in and we do all the back end HR work, and we give you a 24/7 HR expert. It's a veteran-owned company. It's really cool. We're putting a lot of technology into it. And then I am sort of the resident cultural strategy person.
Nice.
So I can do, of course, kind of a lot of different things, organizational development, culture, leadership, etc. But I really focus on 2 things. And one is that a lot of businesses have a lot of business plans, but they don't really have a culture plan, right? They don't have a culture strategy. So how are you going to get there? They just think like a good culture is just something that will happen because they're good people, and it's not. And the thing is, if you're not building kind of a positive culture, you might be unintentionally building a negative culture. So that's the downside. And then on the other end, I also help companies implement leadership development programs. And this is a lot of the speaking that I do. And I really kind of focus on young leaders. So, in my situation, I was 22 years old. I was handed a commission and a bunch of people I was in charge of and said, go to war. And there's a lot that you can do to step into your own leadership when you're a young person. And, so I'm now 32. I'm right in the middle of the millennial age group, and most of my colleagues in the corporate world are getting into their first kind of major leadership positions. And there's a lot that the company can do to implement leadership training programs for them, but there's also a lot that they can do themselves to step into their leadership, to develop themselves. And that's what I do. And I also host a podcast called the Cavness HR Culture Podcast, and that is where I interview people across a huge diverse spectrum of types of career fields. And I interview standout leaders to talk about leadership and culture.
Nice. And you're working on a book? What's up with the book? Tell you what.
So I'm working on this book. It's currently called Cultured. But basically it's a memoir. It's going to be a longer version of all the things we talked about, and where I am today, and the themes are going to be, socialization and group behavior and overcoming and a lot of the different things that we talked about today.
Right on. Well, I appreciate you taking the time, Daniela. Everybody give it up. Daniela Young.
Thank you so much, Brian. This was an amazing conversation.
You've been listening to Half the City with Brian Shinborn, presented by 8B Media. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast, share it with your friends, and leave a solid 5-star review to ensure these stories get spread far and wide. For more information, as well as to listen to other shows, including Relentless, a survivor's search for passion, purpose, and inner peace, and Beyond Relentless, be sure to check out 8bmedia.com. Thank you for listening.